Chapter 6. A little less French, a little more German. The following morning, Beatrix came into Piero's bedroom to tell him that they were going to take a trip down the mountain in order to buy him some new clothes. "These things you brought with you from Paris were not suitable for here," she said, glancing round and walking over to close the door. "The master has very strict ideas about such things, and it will be safer for you to wear traditional German clothing anyway. Your own clothes were a little too bohemian for his tastes." "Safer?" asked Piero, surprised by her choice of words. "It wasn't easy to persuade him to let you come here," she explained. "He's not accustomed to children. I had to promise that you would be no trouble." "Doesn't he have any of his own?" Piero had hoped that there might be another child his age who would come when the master did. "No, and it would be best if you didn't do anything to upset him, in case he decides to send you back to Orleans." "The orphanage wasn't as bad as I thought it would be," said Piero. "Simone and Adele were very kind to me." "I'm sure they were, but it's family that matters, and you and I are family, the only family that either one of us has left. We must never let each other down." Piero nodded, but there was one thing that he'd been thinking about ever since his aunt's letter arrived. "Why did we never meet until now?" he asked. "How come you never visited Papa, Maman, and me in Paris?" Beatrix shook her head and stood up. "That's not a story for you today," she said, "but we'll talk about it another time if you like. Now come along, you must be hungry." After breakfast, they made their way outside to where Ernst was leaning casually against the car, reading a newspaper. When he looked up and saw them, he smiled and folded it in half, placing it under his arm and opening the back door. Piero glanced at his uniform, how smart it looked, and wondered whether his aunt might be persuaded to buy him something like that. He'd always liked uniforms. His father had kept one in a wardrobe in their Paris apartment, an apple green cloth tunic with a rounded collar, 6 buttons running down the centre, and trousers to match. But never wore it. Once, when Papa caught Piero trying on the jacket, he had frozen in the doorway, unable to move, and Maman had scolded her son for rooting around in things that were not his. "Good morning, Piero," said the chauffeur cheerfully, tousling the boy's hair. "Did you sleep well?" "Very well, thank you." "I had a dream last night that I was playing football for Germany," said Ernst. "I scored the winning goal against the English, and everyone cheered as I was carried off the field on their soldiers by the other players." Piero nodded. He didn't like when people recounted their dreams. Like some of Ansel's more complicated stories, they never really made any sense. Where to, Fräulein Fischer?" Ernst asked, bowing low before Beatrix and tipping his cap dramatically. She laughed as she climbed into the back seat. "I must have received a promotion, Piero," she said. "Ernst never refers to me in such respectful terms. Into town, please. Piero needs new clothes." "Don't listen to her," said Ernst, taking his place in the driver's seat and turning the ignition on. "Your aunt knows how highly I think of her." Piero turned to look at Beatrix, whose eyes were meeting the chauffeur's in the rear-view mirror, and noticed the half-smile that lit up her face and the slight flush of red that appeared on her cheeks. As they drove off, he glanced round through the back window and got a view of the house as it disappeared from sight. It was very beautiful, its blonde wooden frame standing out amid the ruggedy, snowy landscape like an unexpected charm. "I remember the first time I saw it," Beatrix said, following the direction of his eyes. "I couldn't believe how tranquil it was. I felt certain that this would be a place of great serenity." "It is," muttered Ernst under his breath, but loud enough for Piero to hear. "When he's not around." "How long have you lived here?" asked Piero, turning back to his aunt. "Well, I was 34 when I first arrived, so it must be a little over 2 years now." Piero examined her carefully. She was very beautiful, that much was obvious, with long red hair that curled up a little around her shoulders, and pale, unblemished skin. "So you're 36?" he asked after a moment. "That's so old!" "Ha!" cried Beatrix, bursting out laughing. "Piero, you and I need to have a little talk," said Ernst. "If you're ever going to find a girlfriend, you need to know how to speak to one. You must never tell a woman that she looks old. Always guess 5 years younger than you really think." "I don't want a girlfriend," said Piero quickly, appalled by the idea. "You say that now. Let's see how you feel in a few years' time." Piero shook his head. He remembered Ansel going all silly over a new girl in their class, writing stories for her and leaving flowers on her desk. He had had to have a serious talk with his friend about it, but there was nothing he could do to change his mind. Ansel was smitten. The whole thing had seemed utterly ridiculous to Piero. "How old are you, Ernst?" asked Piero, leaning forward and moving his body into the gap between the two front seats to get a better look at the chauffeur. "I'm 27, said Ernst, glancing back at him. "I know, it's impossible to believe. I look like a boy in the first flush of youth." "Eyes on the road, Ernst," said Aunt Beatrix quietly, but her tone betrayed her amusement. "And sit back, Piero. It's dangerous to sit like that. If we hit a bump—" "Are you going to marry Herta?" asked Piero, interrupting her. "Herta? Which Herta?" "The maid at the house." "Herta Thayson?" asked Ernst, raising his voice in horror. "Good God, no! Why on earth would you think that?" "She said you were handsome and funny and thoughtful." Beatrix burst out laughing and covered her mouth with her hands. "Can it be true, Ernst?" she asked, teasing him. "Is the mild-mannered Herta in love with you?" "Women are always falling in love with me," said Ernst with a shrug. "It's a cross I have to bear. They take one look at me, and that's it. They're lost forever." He clicked his fingers. "It's not easy being this handsome, you know." "Or that humble," added Beatrix. "Perhaps she likes your uniform," suggested Piero. "Every girl likes a man in uniform," said Ernst. "Every girl, perhaps," remarked Beatrix, "but not every uniform." "You know why people wear uniforms, don't you, Piero?" continued the chauffeur. The boy shook his head. "Because a person who wears one believes he can do anything he likes." "Ernst," said Beatrix quietly, "he can treat others in a way he never would while wearing normal clothes. Collars, trench coats, or jackboots. Uniforms allow us to exercise our cruelty without ever feeling guilt." "Ernst, that's enough," insisted Beatrix. "You don't think I'm right?" "You know I do," said Beatrix, "but this isn't the time for such a conversation." Ernst said nothing and drove on silently while Piero considered what he had said and tried to make sense of it. He didn't really agree with him. He loved uniforms and wished he had one of his own. "Are there any children to play with here?" he asked after a moment. "I'm afraid not," said Beatrix. "In the town, yes, there are many, and of course you'll start school soon, so I dare say you'll make some friends there." "Will they be able to come to the mountain top to play?" "Nope, the master wouldn't like that." "We'll have to take care of each other from now on, Piero," said Ernst from the front seat. "I need another man about the place. The way these women bully me is monstrous." "But you're old," said Piero. "Not that old. 27 is ancient." "If he's ancient," asked Beatrix, "what does that make me?" Piero hesitated for a moment. "Prehistoric," he said, giggling. Beatrix burst out laughing. "Oh, my little Piero," said Ernst, "you have a lot to learn about women." "Did you have a lot of friends in Paris?" Beatrix asked, and Piero nodded. "Quite a few," he said, "and one mortal enemy who called me La Petite because I was so small." "You'll grow," said Beatrix. "And bullies are everywhere," said Ernst at the same time. "But my very best friend, Ansel, lived downstairs from us. And he's the one I miss the most. He's taking care of my dog, D'Artagnan, because I wasn't allowed to take him to the orphanage. I stayed with him for a few weeks when Maman died, but his mother didn't want me to live with them." "Why not?" asked Ernst. Piero thought about this and considered recounting the conversation he'd overheard between Madame Bronstein and her friend in the kitchen that day, but decided against it. He still remembered how angry she had grown when she found him wearing Ansel's yarmulke, and wondered how she didn't want him to come to temple with them. "Ansel and I spent most of our time together," he said, ignoring Ernst's question, "when he wasn't writing his stories, that is." "His stories?" asked Ernst. "He wants to be a writer when he grows up." Beatrix smiled for a moment. "Is that what you want to be too?" "No," said Piero. "I tried a few times, but I could never get the words down sensibly. I used to make things up, though, or talk about funny things that happened at school, and then he would go away for an hour, and when he came back, he'd hand me the pages. He always said that even though he had written it, it was still my story." Beatrix's fingers drummed on the leather seats as she considered this. "Ansel," she said after a moment. "It was his mother who wrote to me, of course, and who told me where I could find you. Remind me, Piero, what was your friend's surname?" "Bronstein." "Ansel Bronstein, I see." Once again, Piero noticed his aunt's eyes flicker towards Ernst in the rearview mirror, and this time the chauffeur offered a slight shake of his head, his expression quite serious now. "It's going to be boring here," said Piero in a defeated tone. "There's always plenty to do to keep you busy when you're not at school," said Beatrix, "and I'm sure we'll find some work for you to do." "Work?" asked Piero, looking at her in surprise. "Yes, of course. Everyone in the house at the top of the mountain must work. Even you. Work will set us free. That's what the master says." "I thought I was already free," said Piero. "I thought that too," said Ernst. "Turns out we were both wrong." "Stop it, Ernst," snapped Beatrix. "What kind of work?" asked Piero. "I'm not sure yet," she replied. "The master might have some ideas on that subject. If not, I'm sure Herta and I will come up with something. Or you might help Emma in the kitchen." "Oh, don't look so worried, Piero. These days, every German is obliged to contribute something to the fatherland, no matter how young or old." "But I'm not German," said Piero. "I'm French." Beatrix turned to him quickly, and the smile faded from her face. "You were born in France, that's true," she said, "and your mother was French. But your father, my older brother, was German, and that makes you German too. Do you understand? From now on, it's best that you don't ever refer to where you came from." "But why?" "Because it'll be safer that way," she said. "And there's one other thing I want to discuss with you. Your name." "My name?" Piero asked, looking across at her, frowning. "Yes." She hesitated, as if she could scarcely believe what she was about to say. "I don't think we should call you Piero anymore." His mouth dropped open in surprise. He couldn't quite believe what she was saying. "But I've always been called Piero," he said. It's my name. But it's such a French name, and I thought perhaps we might call you Peter instead. It's the same name, it's only the German version. It's not so very different." "But I'm not a Peter," insisted Piero. "I'm a Piero." "Please, Peter. Piero." "Can you trust me on this? In your heart, you can still be Piero, of course. But at the top of the mountain, when other people are around, and particularly when the master and mistress are here, you will be Peter." Piero sighed. "But I don't like it," he said. "You must understand that I only have your best interests at heart. That's why I brought you here to live with me. I want to keep you safe, and this is the only way I knew how to do it. I need you to be obedient, Peter, even if it seems at times that the things I ask you to do are a little odd." They drove on in silence for a while longer, still descending the mountain, and Piero wondered how much more of his life was going to change before the year was out. What's the name of the town we're going to? He asked finally. Berchtesgaden, replied Beatrix. It's not too far now. We'll be here in a few minutes. Are we still in Salzburg? Piero asked, for that was the last place name that had been tagged on his coat. No, we're about 20 miles from there, she replied. The mountains you see around here are the Bavarian Alps. Over there, she pointed out the left-hand window, is the border with Austria. And over there, she pointed out of the right, is Munich. You passed through Munich on your way here, didn't you? Yes, said Piero. And Mannheim, he added, remembering the soldier at the station who stood on his fingers and seemed to enjoy the pain he was inflicting. So over there, he added, reaching his hand out and pointing into the distance, over the mountains and into the unseen world beyond, must be Paris. Over there is my home. Beatrix shook her head and pressed Piero's hand down. No, Peter, she said, looking back up towards the top of the mountain. Up there is your home, on the Obersalzberg. That's where you live now. You mustn't think of Paris any more. You must not see it again for a long time. Piero felt a great sorrow building inside him, and Maman's face appeared in his mind, an image forming of them sitting side by side by the fireplace in the evening, while she carried on with her knitting, and he read a book or did a bit of drawing in a sketchbook. He thought of D'Artagnan and Madame Bronstein upstairs, and when he thought of Ansel, his fingers made the sign of the fox and then the sign of the dog. I want to go home, he thought to himself, twisting his hands in ways that only Ansel would understand. What are you doing? Asked Beatrix. Nothing, said Piero, placing his hands by his sides again and staring out of the window. A few minutes later they arrived in the market town of Berchtesgaden, and Ernst pulled the car into a quiet spot. Will you be long? He asked, turning round and looking at Beatrix. A little while, perhaps, she said. He needs clothes. He needs shoes. We could do with a haircut too, don't you think? We need to make him a little less French and a little more German. The chauffeur glanced at Piero for a moment and nodded. Yeah, probably, he said. The smarter he looks, the better for all of us. He could still change his mind after all. Who could change his mind? Asked Piero. Shall we say 2 hours? Said Aunt Beatrix, ignoring him. Yes, that's fine. What time are you? Just before noon. The meeting will only take an hour or so. What meeting are you going to? Asked Piero. I'm not going to any meeting, replied Ernst. But you just said... Peter, shush, said Beatrix irritably. Did no one ever tell you not to listen in on other people's conversations? But I'm sitting right here, he protested. How could I not hear you? It's fine, said Ernst, turning back to look at the boy and smiling. Did you enjoy the drive? He asked. I suppose so, said Piero. Expect one day you would like to learn to drive a car like this. Piero nodded. I would. I like cars. Well, if you're good, then perhaps I'll teach you. That will be a favour I do for you, and in return, will you do a favour for me? Piero turned to look at his aunt, but she was silent. I can try. No, I need you to do more than try, said Ernst. I need you to promise. All right, I promise, agreed Piero. What is it? Your friend, Ansel Bronstein. What about him? Piero asked, frowning. Ernst, said Beatrix nervously, leaning forward. Just a moment, please, Beatrix, said the chauffeur in the most serious tone he had used that morning. The favour is that I want you to never mention this boy's name when you're in the house at the top of the mountain. Do you understand? Piero stared at him as if he'd gone mad. But why not? He asked. He's my friend. I've known him since I was born. He's practically my brother. No, said the chauffeur in a sharp tone. He's not your brother. Don't say such a thing. Think it if you must, but don't say it out loud. Ernst is right, said Beatrix. It'll be the best if you don't talk about your past at all. Keep your memories in your head, of course, but don't speak of them. And don't speak of this boy Ansel, insisted Ernst. I can't talk about my friends. I can't use my own name, said Piero in frustration. Is there anything else I can't do? No, that's all, said Ernst, smiling at him. You follow those rules, and one day I'll teach you to drive. All right, said Piero slowly, wondering whether the chauffeur was perhaps a little funny in the head. Not a good attribute in a man who had to drive the car up and down a steep mountainside several times a day. 2 hours then, said Ernst as they got out. As Piero walked away, he glanced back to see the chauffeur touch his aunt affectionately on the elbow, and they looked directly into each other's eyes, not smiling so much as sharing an anxious moment. The market town was rather busy, and Aunt Beatrix said hello to a few acquaintances as they walked along, introducing Piero to them and telling them that he had come to live with her. There was a lot of soldiers there, 4 of whom were sitting outside a tavern, smoking and drinking beer, even though it was still early in the day. When they saw Beatrix approaching, they threw their cigarettes away and sat up straight. One tried to place his helmet in front of his beer glass, but it was far too small to be hidden. Piero's aunt deliberately didn't look in their direction as she passed, but the boy couldn't help but be intrigued by the flurry of activity her arrival had provoked. Do you know those soldiers? He asked. No, said Beatrix, but they know me. They're worried that I will report them for drinking when they should be on patrol. Whenever the master is away, they become less conscientious in their duties. Now, here we are, she said, as they arrived outside of a clothes shop. Don't these look suitable? The next couple of hours were perhaps the most boring of Piero's life. Beatrix insisted on him trying on traditional German boys' clothes, white shirts and lederhosen held up by brown leather braces with long knee socks worn outside his trousers. And then he was taken to a shoe shop where his feet were measured and he was forced to walk up and down the shop while everybody watched him. Afterwards, they returned to the first shop where alterations had been made and he had to try everything on all over again, one by one, and turn around in the center of the floor as his aunt and the assistant told him how handsome he looked. He felt like an idiot. Can we go now? He asked as she paid the bill. Yes, of course, she replied. Are you hungry? Should we get some lunch? Piero didn't need to think about this. He was always hungry. And when he told her this, Beatrix laughed out loud. Just like your father, she told him. Can I ask you something? He asked as they entered a cafe and ordered soup and sandwiches, and his aunt nodded her head. Yes, of course. Why did you never come to see us when I was little? Beatrix considered this, but waited until the food had arrived before speaking. Your father and I were never very close as children, she said. He was older than me, and we had little in common. But when he went to fight in the Great War, I missed him terribly and worried about him all the time. He wrote letters home, of course, and sometimes they made sense, but sometimes they were rather incoherent. He was badly injured, as you know. No, said Piero, surprised. No, I didn't know. Oh, yes, I wonder why no one ever told you. He was in the trenches one night when a group of British soldiers attacked and overpowered them. They killed almost everyone, but somehow your father managed to escape. Although he took a bullet to his shoulder that would have killed him had it been a few inches to the right. He hid in the forest nearby and watched as the soldiers dragged one unfortunate young boy from his hiding place, the last surviving soldier from that trench, and argued over what to do with him before one of the English simply shot him in the head. Somehow, Wilhelm made it back to German lines, but he had lost a lot of blood and was delirious. They managed to patch him up and send him to the hospital for a few weeks, and he could have stayed, but no, he insisted on returning to the front when he was better. She looked round to make sure that she was not being overheard, and lowered her voice almost to a whisper. I think that his injuries, coupled with what he saw that night, did great damage to his mind. After the war, he was never the same. He grew so angry, so full of hatred towards anyone he thought had cost Germany her victory. We fell out over it. I hated to see how blinkered he was, and he claimed that I just didn't know what I was talking about, since I'd never seen any of the action. Piero frowned, trying to understand what she meant. But weren't you on the same side? He asked. Well, in a way, she replied. But Peter, this isn't a conversation for now. Perhaps when you're older I'll be able to explain it better to you. When you understand a little more of the world. Now we need to eat quickly and get back. Ernst will be waiting for us. But his meeting won't be over yet. Beatrix turned and stared at the boy. He didn't have any meeting, Peter, she said, her tone growing a little angry now. The first time he had heard her speak like this. He is waiting in the same spot where we left him, and he'll be there when we return. Do you understand me? Piero nodded, a little frightened. All right, he said, deciding not to bring the subject up again, even though he knew what he had heard, and there was no one in the world who could tell him differently.